Power comes with a price, and Richard Sterling has built his billion-dollar empire on the belief that everyone has their place in the hierarchy. Emma Collins knows her place. She makes perfect coffee, organizes flawless schedules, and stays invisible in the corner office. But when you're invisible, you see everything. Behind the quarterly reports and board meetings, behind the champagne galas and business awards, lies a web of secrets that could destroy everything Sterling has built. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody notices. What happens when the perfect assistant becomes the perfect enemy? A story of corporate corruption, workplace power dynamics, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up to those who believe they're untouchable. Some falls are louder than others. Some are more deserved. Richard Sterling was screaming at his printer again. The damn thing had jammed for the third time this morning, and the quarterly reports were due in 20 minutes. His face was red with frustration, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his fingers through it, when Emma Collins appeared in his doorway with a fresh stack of printed reports. "I thought you might need these," she said quietly, placing the documents on his desk. "I printed them from my computer when I heard the commotion." Richard straightened his tie, his composure returning as quickly as it had vanished. At 45, he had built Sterling Innovations into a billion-dollar empire, but moments like these reminded him that even kings could be undone by the smallest mechanical failures. He cleared his throat, pretending the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. "Mr. Sterling?" The voice behind him was soft, professional, tinged with the faintest hint of exhaustion that came from starting work at 6:30 every morning. "The board members are arriving for the 9 o'clock meeting." Richard didn't turn around immediately. He let the silence stretch, a power play he'd perfected over the years. Emma Collins stood in the doorway of his corner office, her brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, her navy blazer pressed and professional despite the early hour. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. His coffee, prepared exactly as he liked it. Ethiopian blend, 2 sugars, no cream. "Are the quarterly reports ready?" Richard asked, finally turning to face her. Emma was 28, possessed of an MBA from Columbia, and had been working as his executive assistant for 3 years. She was also, in Richard's estimation, exactly where she belonged, efficient, invisible, and completely under his control. "Yes, sir. I've prepared individual portfolios for each board member, highlighted the key performance indicators you wanted to emphasize, and included the projected growth charts for the next fiscal year." Emma stepped forward, placing the coffee on his desk with practiced precision. "I also took the liberty of preparing talking points for the Q4 marketing strategy discussion." Richard picked up the coffee, taking a sip while his eyes scanned the portfolio she'd handed him. The work was flawless, as always. Emma had an uncanny ability to anticipate not just what he needed, but what he wanted to say before he'd even thought it himself. It was a talent that would have made her invaluable in any executive position, but Richard preferred to keep valuable things close and under his direct control. "These projections," he said, pointing to a chart near the back of the portfolio. "Where did you get these numbers?" Emma straightened slightly. "I analyzed the market trends from the past 18 months and cross-referenced them with our product launch cycles. The correlation suggests that if we shift our marketing focus to target mid-level enterprises rather than just Fortune 500 companies, we could see a 30% increase in revenue by Q2 next year." Richard studied the chart more carefully. The analysis was brilliant, the kind of strategic thinking that companies paid consulting firms millions to provide. Emma had done it over the weekend, probably working from her cramped studio apartment in Queens while he was at his Hamptons estate. "Interesting," he said, closing the portfolio. "I'll present this to the board." Emma blinked. "You'll present it? Is there a problem with that?" Richard's voice carried a subtle edge, the tone of a man who didn't appreciate being questioned. "No, sir. Of course not." Emma's professional mask slipped back into place, but Richard caught the flash of disappointment in her eyes. Good. It was important that she understood her position. The boardroom began filling up at 8:45, Richard watched through the glass walls as New York's business elite took their seats around the mahogany conference table. These were men who controlled billions, who made decisions that affected thousands of jobs, who understood that in the corporate world, perception was reality, and image was everything. "Emma," Richard called as she prepared to leave his office, "I want you to take notes during the meeting. Sit in the corner, don't speak unless spoken to." "Actually, sir, I was hoping I could—" "You were hoping what?" Richard's voice cut through her sentence like a blade. Emma hesitated, her hand tightening on her portfolio. "I was hoping I could contribute to the discussion about the marketing strategy. Since I prepared the analysis—" Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Emma, you're very good at what you do. You make excellent coffee. You organize my schedule perfectly, and you prepare adequate reports. But strategic discussion? That's not your job. That's not your place." The words landed like physical blows. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. I understand." "Good. Now, let's not keep the board waiting." The meeting proceeded exactly as Richard had orchestrated. He presented Emma's marketing analysis as his own breakthrough insight, watching as the board members nodded appreciatively at his innovative approach to market expansion. He could feel Emma's eyes on him from her corner seat, could sense the tension radiating from her rigid posture, but he didn't acknowledge her presence. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking strategy that sets Sterling Innovations apart," declared Margaret Hoffman, the board's senior member. "Richard, your ability to identify these market opportunities is remarkable." "Thank you, Margaret. It's all about staying ahead of the curve, reading the data that others miss." Richard clicked to the next slide, another of Emma's charts. "This projection here shows that we're not just following trends, we're creating them." The presentation continued for another hour. Richard fielded questions about implementation timelines, budget allocations, and resource requirements. All answers that Emma had prepared for him in meticulous detail. When the meeting concluded, the board members filed out with congratulations and expressions of confidence in the company's direction. Emma remained in her corner, methodically packing her notes into her portfolio. Richard approached her as the last board member left. "Good meeting," he said casually. "Your note-taking was adequate." Emma looked up at him, her professional mask firmly in place. "Thank you, sir. Will there be anything else?" "Actually, yes. I want you to prepare a detailed implementation plan for the marketing strategy we discussed. I'll need it by tomorrow morning." "The strategy that I—" Emma caught herself, took a breath. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'll have it ready." Richard smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Excellent. Oh, and Emma, in the future, let's keep your ideas flowing through the proper channels. You understand how important hierarchy is in a successful organization?" Emma nodded, her jaw tight. "I understand perfectly, sir." As Richard walked back to his office, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a lesson well taught. Order was essential in business, and everyone needed to know their place. Emma was brilliant, yes, but brilliance without proper context was just chaos. It was his job to provide that context, to channel her talents in ways that served the greater good of Sterling Innovations. From his office window, Richard watched the city bustle below. Somewhere in those streets were thousands of people who would never have what he had, who would never achieve what he'd achieved. The thought didn't make him feel guilty. It made him feel grateful. Grateful for his success, his power, and his ability to maintain the natural order of things. Behind him, Emma was already at her desk, working on the implementation plan for the strategy she'd created, but would never receive credit for. The soft clicking of her keyboard was a familiar sound, the soundtrack of efficiency and quiet competence. Richard poured himself another cup of coffee from the expensive machine in his office, not as good as the one Emma made, but adequate, and settled in to review the contracts that would make him even richer by the day's end. Outside, the city hummed with ambition and dreams, most of which would never be realized. It was, Richard thought, exactly as it should be. But in the corner office, as Emma typed her recommendations for a strategy that would generate millions in revenue, she was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about justice, about recognition, and about the growing weight of evidence she'd been quietly collecting about Richard Sterling's less public business practices. The golden cage, she was beginning to realize, had locks on both sides. Emma's discovery came by accident, buried in a misfiled email attachment that Richard had forgotten to delete from the shared server. She was looking for the original contract terms for the Henderson Group when she stumbled across a spreadsheet labeled Pension Fund Reallocations, Q3 Analysis. The file name itself wouldn't have raised red flags, but the timestamp showed it was created at 2:47 a.m. on a Sunday, hardly normal business hours for legitimate financial planning. Her coffee grew cold as she scrolled through the numbers. Transfers of $2.3 million to Sterling Holdings, Richard's personal investment company. Another $1.8 million to Meridian Properties, the same company that owned Richard's Hamptons estate. The pattern was clear. Employee pension funds were being systematically drained to finance Richard's lifestyle. "Son of a bitch," Emma whispered, her hands trembling as she printed the document. She'd heard rumors about companies raiding pension funds, but seeing it in black and white was different. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were the retirement dreams of janitors and security guards, administrative assistants and maintenance workers. 3 weeks later, Sterling Innovations was hosting its annual gala at the Plaza Hotel. The event was Richard's favorite kind of theater. 500 guests in designer clothes, champagne flowing like water, and reporters from Forbes and Fortune documenting his every move. Emma watched from the sidelines as Richard worked the room, his charm turned up to maximum wattage. "Emma!" Richard's voice cut through the cocktail chatter. "Come here, I want you to meet someone." She approached cautiously, smoothing her simple black dress, the most expensive item in her wardrobe, bought specifically for company events. Richard stood next to James Morrison, the CEO of TechFlow Industries, a man whose handshake could make or break smaller companies. "James, this is Emma Collins, my assistant," Richard said, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture that appeared friendly but felt possessive. "Emma, Mr. Morrison was just telling me about his company's expansion plans." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Collins," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Richard's told me you're quite capable." Before Emma could respond, Richard laughed. "Oh, she's more than capable. She's indispensable. Aren't you, Emma? Tell Mr. Morrison what you do for me." The question hung in the air like a trap. Emma could feel the weight of Morrison's attention, the subtle shift in Richard's demeanor that suggested this was some kind of test. Around them, conversations continued, but she felt isolated in a bubble of expectation. "I manage Mr. Sterling's schedule and handle various administrative tasks," she said carefully. "Administrative tasks," Richard repeated, his smile never wavering. She's being modest. Emma here keeps my entire operation running smoothly. She's like a Swiss watch, precise, reliable, and she never needs winding. He paused, letting the comparison sink in. The perfect assistant knows her place in the machine. Morrison chuckled politely, but Emma caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Well, good help is hard to find these days. Exactly. Emma, why don't you get Mr. Morrison a fresh drink? I believe he was having the Macallan. It wasn't a request. Emma felt her face flush as she realized what Richard was doing, reducing her to a waitress in front of one of the most powerful men in the industry. But she maintained her composure, years of practice helping her swallow the humiliation. Of course, Mr. Sterling. As she walked toward the bar, Emma could hear Richard's voice behind her. You have to establish boundaries early, James. Give them too much leeway and they start getting ideas above their station. The night deteriorated from there. Richard seemed to take particular pleasure in summoning Emma for increasingly menial tasks, fetching his coat, delivering messages to other guests, even cleaning up spilled champagne from his table. Each request was delivered with a smile, each task designed to remind everyone present of the hierarchy. The breaking point came during Richard's speech. He stood at the podium, looking resplendent in his custom tuxedo, addressing the crowd about Sterling Innovation's record-breaking year. Behind him, a slideshow displayed charts and graphs that Emma had prepared, showing the company's growth trajectory. "Our success this year has been unprecedented," Richard declared, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "We've achieved a 40% increase in revenue, expanded into 3 new markets, and established partnerships that will define the next decade of innovation." The crowd applauded. Emma stood near the back of the room, watching Richard bask in the acclaim for achievements that had been built on stolen pension funds and uncredited ideas. "But success isn't just about numbers," Richard continued. "It's about knowing your role in the larger picture. Every person in this organization, from the executive suite to the support staff, has a part to play. Some are visionaries, leaders who see the big picture and make the hard decisions. Others are implementers, valuable in their own way, who execute the vision with precision and dedication." His eyes found Emma in the crowd. Success comes from everyone understanding their place in the ecosystem. When people try to step outside their natural roles, when they forget where they belong in the hierarchy, that's when organizations fail. The applause was thunderous. Emma felt sick. Later, as the evening wound down, Richard approached her near the coat check. He was slightly drunk, his usual calculated control loosened by champagne and adulation. "Hell of a speech, wasn't it?" he said, adjusting his bow tie. "Did you see Morrison's face when I talked about knowing your place? I think he finally understood what I meant about proper management." Emma stared at him, all pretense of professional courtesy evaporating. "You're despicable." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. The way you treated me tonight, the way you treat everyone who works for you, it's despicable." "Emma, I think you've had too much champagne. I haven't had a single drink." Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I've been working this entire evening, running your errands, playing your games, while you stood up there talking about people knowing their place." Richard's expression hardened. "You're out of line." "Am I? When was the last time you gave credit where it was due? When was the last time you acknowledged that your success is built on other people's work? I think you should go home, Emma. Sleep this off. We'll pretend this conversation never happened." Emma pulled her phone from her purse, holding it up so Richard could see the screen. The video was already uploading to 3 different platforms: TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. 23 minutes of footage showing Richard's treatment of her throughout the evening, complete with his condescending comments and casual cruelty. "What the hell is that?" Richard's voice was sharp with alarm. "Insurance," Emma said simply. "I've been documenting everything for months, Richard. Tonight was just the finale." Richard lunged for the phone, but Emma stepped back. "It's too late. It's already uploaded. Know Your Place is probably trending by now." "You have no idea what you've done," Richard hissed. "I will destroy you for this. I will make sure you never work in this industry again." Emma smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You can try, but I think you're going to be too busy dealing with some other problems." She pulled a manila envelope from her purse, placing it on the table next to them. "Pension fund reallocations, Richard. Very interesting reading. The SEC might find it educational." Richard's face went white. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. 2.3 million to Sterling Holdings, 1.8 million to Meridian Properties. Should I continue?" The color drained from Richard's face completely. Around them, the last guests were saying their goodbyes, oblivious to the drama playing out in the corner. "This is corporate espionage," Richard whispered. "I'll have you arrested." "No, this is justice." Emma picked up her coat, slipping it over her shoulders. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Sterling. I have a feeling it's going to be your last good one for a while." She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Behind her, Richard stood frozen, the envelope in his trembling hands, finally understanding that his perfect world was about to come crashing down. The storm, Emma thought as she stepped into the cool night air, was just beginning. Richard's phone was already buzzing before he reached his apartment. The first call was from his publicist, her voice tight with panic. "Richard, we have a problem. There's a video going viral. You need to see this." He didn't need to see it. He'd lived it. But as he sat in his $4 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, watching his professional destruction unfold in real time on his laptop screen, the full scope of Emma's strategy became clear. The video wasn't just documentation. It was a masterclass in narrative construction. 23 minutes of footage, expertly edited to show the progression of his behavior throughout the evening. His condescending comments to Emma, his casual cruelty disguised as management philosophy. The speech where he'd essentially advocated for a caste system in corporate America. All of it set to the backdrop of New York's elite, champagne glasses in hand, nodding approvingly at his vision of hierarchical domination. The comments section was brutal. Know Your Place had indeed gone viral, but not in the way Richard had intended during his speech. People were using it to share their own stories of workplace humiliation, toxic bosses, and corporate abuse. His face had become the poster child for everything wrong with American business culture. By morning, the video had 3 million views and counting. Richard's phone rang constantly. Reporters, board members, investors, all asking the same question. What the hell were you thinking? Margaret Hoffman arrived at his office at 7 a.m., her usual polished composure replaced by barely contained fury. "Sit down, Richard. We need to talk." "Margaret, I can explain." "No, you need to listen." She dropped a stack of newspapers on his desk. The headlines were variations on the same theme. Tech CEO's toxic tirade, the millionaire's meltdown, sterling example of corporate cruelty. "The board met at 6 this morning," Margaret continued. "Emergency session, damage control. Do you want to know what we decided?" Richard's mouth felt dry. "What?" "Suspension pending investigation, effective immediately." "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious. The SEC called my personal line at 5:30 this morning. They're opening an investigation into Sterling Innovation's financial practices. Apparently someone provided them with some very interesting documents about pension fund management." Richard's blood turned to ice. "Emma." "Yes, Emma, your assistant. The woman you publicly humiliated while she was sitting on evidence that could land you in federal prison." Margaret's voice was acidic. "Brilliant strategy, Richard. Really showed that Harvard MBA training." The next few days blurred together in a haze of legal meetings and crisis management. Richard's lawyers worked around the clock to limit the damage, but Emma had been thorough. She'd provided the authorities with 3 years' worth of documentation, emails, financial records, recorded conversations, and a detailed timeline of Richard's pattern of abuse toward employees. The stock price plummeted. Sterling Innovations lost 40% of its value in the first week. Major clients began pulling contracts. The board voted to distance themselves from Richard's leadership, appointing Marcus Webb as interim CEO, while they evaluated the company's future direction. Richard found himself effectively exiled from his own company. Security badges deactivated, access revoked. The empire he'd built was suddenly off limits to him, and he watched its dismantling from the outside like a general whose army had mutinied. But the financial and legal troubles were nothing compared to the social media storm. Emma's video had opened floodgates. Current and former Sterling Innovations employees began sharing their own stories of Richard's behavior. The hashtag #SarkSterlingStories became a collection of workplace horror stories, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Richard as a corporate tyrant. Sarah Chen, a former marketing director, posted about how Richard had taken credit for her product launch strategy and then fired her when she protested. Mike Rodriguez, a software engineer, shared audio recordings of Richard berating him for not knowing his place when he'd suggested improvements to the company's security protocols. The stories multiplied exponentially, each one more damaging than the last. Richard's attempts at damage control backfired spectacularly. His first public statement, a carefully crafted non-apology that blamed misunderstandings and out-of-context footage, only fanned the flames. His second statement, a more aggressive defense of his management style, was eviscerated by business journalists who pointed out that his results-oriented approach had apparently included stealing from his own employees. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the gala. Richard was having lunch at his usual spot, Le Bernardin, where he'd been dining every Friday for 5 years, when he overheard a conversation at the next table. "Did you see that Sterling guy's latest interview?" one woman was saying. "He actually tried to claim that his assistant was trying to sabotage the company from within, like she was some kind of corporate spy." "The delusion is incredible," her companion replied. "The man got caught stealing from pension funds, and he's still trying to play the victim." Richard's face burned with humiliation. He'd become a cautionary tale, a punchline, a symbol of everything wrong with corporate culture. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of recognition, the whispered comments, the judgment. That evening, he stood in his apartment, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Awards from industry organizations, photos with politicians and celebrities. A wine collection worth more than most people's annual salaries. All of it felt hollow now, tainted by the knowledge that it had been built on a foundation of cruelty and theft. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Parking garage, level B3, come alone." Richard's hands shook as he read the message. He knew who it was from. Emma had been silent since the gala, letting her evidence speak for itself while his world crumbled around him. But now she wanted to talk. The parking garage was nearly empty at 10 p.m. Richard found Emma standing next to her beat-up Honda Civic, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had in his office. But there was something different about her posture, a confidence that hadn't been there before. "Hello, Richard." "Emma." He stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how the situation might look to security cameras. "What do you want?" "I want to know why you did it," she said simply. "The pension funds, the stealing. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Why steal from people who make $30,000 a year?" Richard's first instinct was to deny everything, to maintain his innocence. But looking at Emma's face, he realized there was no point. She had all the evidence. She knew the truth. "Because I could," he said finally. "Because it was easy. Because no one was watching." Emma nodded slowly. "And the way you treated me? The way you treated everyone who worked for you? Was that because you could too?" "You wouldn't understand," Richard said, his voice defensive. "You've never had to make the hard decisions. You've never had to carry the weight of an entire organization on your shoulders." "You're right. I've never had to carry that weight." Emma stepped closer, her voice steady and calm. "But I've carried other weights. I've carried the weight of knowing that my ideas were being stolen. The weight of watching good people get fired for standing up to you. The weight of knowing that retirement funds were being looted while you bought another yacht." Richard felt something crack inside him. "You don't know what it's like to build something from nothing, to have everyone depending on you, watching you, waiting for you to fail." "So you decided to fail spectacularly?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw something he'd never noticed before. Strength, determination, the kind of quiet courage that he'd mistaken for weakness. "I'm going to destroy you for this," he said, but the words came out hollow, defeated. Emma reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. "You just threatened me again, Richard, in a parking garage, after everything that's happened." She shook her head. "You still don't get it, do you? You still think this is about power and control and who can hurt whom the most. Then what is it about?" "Justice," Emma said simply. "It's about justice and accountability, and making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." She turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and Richard, you might want to check the news tomorrow. The FBI is executing a search warrant on Sterling Innovations. Apparently, pension fund fraud is a federal crime." Richard watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the night. Around him, the parking garage felt like a tomb, cold, empty, and echoing with the sound of his own breathing. Upstairs, in his penthouse, the awards and accolades waited. But they felt like artifacts from someone else's life, remnants of a man who no longer existed. The Richard Sterling who had built an empire was gone, replaced by someone who was about to learn what it felt like to fall. The fall, he realized, was just beginning. Richard's obsession began with a single Google search at 3 a.m. Emma Collins' background check. The insomnia had been getting worse since the FBI raid, and he'd taken to prowling his apartment like a caged animal, surviving on scotch and rage. The first results were disappointingly clean. Emma Marie Collins, 28, born in Newark, New Jersey, MBA from Columbia, summa cum laude. Previous employment at Morrison Financial and Apex Consulting before joining Sterling Innovations. No criminal record, no red flags, no obvious vulnerabilities. But Richard had learned something important during his rise to power. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had something they wanted to hide. He just had to dig deep enough to find it. He hired Vincent Carrera, a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and what he euphemistically called opposition research. Carrera came recommended by Richard's divorce attorney, a man who had successfully destroyed 3 marriages with meticulously gathered evidence. "I need everything," Richard told Carrera during their first meeting at a downtown hotel bar. "Financial records, personal relationships, family history, college transcripts. I want to know every mistake she's ever made, every person she's ever hurt, every secret she's ever kept." Carrera nodded, his weathered face impassive. "This is about the assistant who burned you?" "She destroyed my life," Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I want to return the favor." "Understood. My rate is $500 a day plus expenses. This kind of deep dive usually takes 2 to 3 weeks. Richard slid a check across the table. "Take as long as you need. Money's no object." While Carrera worked, Richard began his own campaign of psychological warfare. He reached out to contacts throughout the industry, spreading carefully crafted rumors about Emma's instability and vindictive nature. He suggested she was a disgruntled employee who had fabricated evidence out of spite. He hinted at emotional problems, professional jealousy, and a history of making false accusations. The strategy was subtle, but effective. Several companies that had initially expressed interest in Emma's consulting services suddenly went quiet. Job interviews that had seemed promising ended with polite rejections. Richard's network was vast, and he activated every connection he had. Emma, meanwhile, was trying to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. She'd rented a small office in Brooklyn and started Collins Strategic Consulting, focusing on helping companies identify and address workplace culture issues. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become a professional reformer of toxic work environments. But Richard's sabotage campaign was taking its toll. Potential clients would express enthusiasm during initial meetings, then mysteriously change their minds after conducting additional research. Emma began to suspect she was being blacklisted, but proving it was another matter entirely. The breakthrough came when Carrera called with an update. "I've got something interesting," he said. "Your girl isn't quite as clean as she appears." They met at the same hotel bar. Carrera spread a collection of documents across the table: bank statements, tax returns, and what appeared to be corporate filing paperwork. "Emma Collins isn't just a whistleblower," Carrera explained. "She's been running a side business for the past 18 months. Collins Strategic Consulting was already incorporated when she went public with your information." Richard studied the documents. "So, she was planning this for over a year?" "Gets better. Look at this." Carrera pointed to a series of financial transactions. She's been receiving regular payments from a legal advocacy group called Workers' Rights Foundation. They specialize in corporate whistleblower cases. She's a professional informant. That's what it looks like. But here's the really interesting part. Carrera pulled out another document. The Workers' Rights Foundation has been funding legal challenges against 3 other major corporations in the past 2 years. All of them involved employees who claimed workplace harassment and financial irregularities. Richard's pulse quickened. She's done this before? 3 times that I can document. Always the same pattern. Insider employee gathers evidence. Legal foundation provides support. Media campaign follows. It's like a business model for corporate takedowns. Richard leaned back, his mind racing. This was exactly what he'd been looking for. Proof that Emma wasn't the innocent victim she claimed to be, but a calculated operator who had targeted him specifically. "I need you to dig deeper," he said. "I want to know everything about this foundation. Who funds them, who runs them, what their agenda is. And I want to know about the other companies she's taken down." Over the next week, Carrera's investigation revealed a complex web of connections. The Workers' Rights Foundation was funded by a combination of union pension funds, progressive philanthropists, and anonymous donors. Their board included labor lawyers, former government regulators, and corporate reform advocates. But the most damaging discovery came when Carrera found Emma's personal connection to the foundation. Her brother, David Collins, was a labor organizer who had worked closely with the foundation on previous cases. Emma hadn't just stumbled into whistleblowing, she'd been recruited. "This is conspiracy," Richard told his lawyer Marcus Webb during an emergency meeting. "She didn't just document my alleged crimes, she infiltrated my company specifically to gather evidence. This is corporate espionage." Webb looked skeptical. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that the evidence she gathered appears to be legitimate. The FBI has confirmed the pension fund transfers. But it proves she was operating in bad faith. She wasn't a genuine employee seeking justice. She was a plant, a spy working for an organization with a specific agenda to destroy successful companies." Richard's revenge plan began to take shape. He would expose Emma's connections to the Workers' Rights Foundation. He would reveal that her whistleblowing wasn't spontaneous moral outrage, but a calculated corporate hit job. He would destroy her credibility and, in the process, undermine the entire case against him. But first, he wanted to confront her directly. Emma was leaving her office late one evening when Richard stepped out of the shadows in the building's parking lot. She tensed immediately, reaching for her phone, but Richard held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Just talk, Emma. That's all I want." "I have nothing to say to you," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "But I have something to say to you." Richard pulled out a manila envelope. "About your brother David. About the Workers' Rights Foundation. About the fact that you've been running this same scam against other companies for years." Emma's expression didn't change, but Richard caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise? Fear? He couldn't tell. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" "Because Vincent Carrera is very thorough. He's documented your connections to the foundation, your brother's involvement, the pattern of corporate takedowns you've participated in. You're not a whistleblower, Emma. You're a professional saboteur." Emma looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "Even if that were true, it doesn't change what you did. You stole from your employees. You created a toxic work environment. You broke the law." "Maybe. But I'm not the only one who broke the law. Corporate espionage is a federal crime. Conspiracy to commit fraud is a federal crime. And when I present this evidence to the FBI, they're going to have some very interesting questions for you." For the first time since the gala, Emma looked genuinely shaken. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Richard stepped closer. "You destroyed my life based on half-truths and selectively edited evidence. Now I'm going to return the favor. By the time I'm done with you, no one will trust anything you say. Your consulting business will be finished. Your reputation will be destroyed, and you'll face the same criminal charges you helped fabricate against me." Emma stared at him for a long moment. You really don't understand, do you? You still think this is about winning and losing, about who can hurt whom the most. What else is there? Truth, Emma said simply. Justice, the difference between right and wrong. Richard laughed bitterly. Save the speeches. I know what you are now. I know what you've done. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. He turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in the parking lot with the envelope at her feet. Inside were copies of all the documents Carrera had gathered, proof of her connections, her brother's involvement, her pattern of targeting corporations. As Richard drove home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: satisfaction. The hunter had become the hunted. The game was back on. But in the parking lot, Emma picked up the envelope and read through its contents with growing amazement. Richard had hired an investigator to dig into her background, and the man had done thorough work. Too thorough, perhaps. Because buried in the documents was information that Richard clearly hadn't read carefully enough. Information about the Workers' Rights Foundation that would change everything. Information about her brother David's work that would reframe the entire story. Information that proved Richard Sterling had no idea what he was really fighting against. Emma smiled for the first time in weeks. The hunter thought he'd found his prey, but sometimes the prey was just leading the hunter into a trap. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was a fortress of granite and glass, its imposing facade reflecting the gray October sky. Richard Sterling sat at the defendant's table, his once perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of 6 months of legal proceedings. The pension fund fraud charges had been devastating enough, but the additional counts of corporate misconduct had painted him as the poster child for everything wrong with American capitalism. His lawyer, David Chen, leaned over to whisper an update. The prosecution is calling their final witness today. After that, it's our turn. Richard nodded absently, his attention focused on the gallery behind him. Emma Collins sat in the third row, flanked by reporters and legal observers. She looked different now, more confident, more authoritative. The woman who had once fetched his coffee was about to testify against him in federal court. The prosecution calls Ms. Emma Collins to the stand. Emma rose and walked to the witness box, her hand steady as she swore the oath. She wore a simple navy suit that conveyed competence without ostentation. When she looked at Richard, her expression was neither hostile nor sympathetic, just professional. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, began with routine questions about Emma's employment history and her role at Sterling Innovations. But Richard's attention was drawn to Vincent Carrera, his private investigator, who had slipped into the courtroom and was now approaching the defense table with an urgent expression. "We have a problem," Carrera whispered to Chen. "You need to see this." He handed over a thick folder. Richard opened it and felt his blood turn to ice. The documents inside told a story that his original investigation had missed, a story about Emma Collins that changed everything. The Workers' Rights Foundation wasn't just a legal advocacy group. It was a comprehensive support network for employees trapped in abusive work environments. Emma's brother David wasn't just a labor organizer. He was a former Sterling Innovations employee who had been blacklisted after trying to report safety violations in the company's manufacturing division. But that wasn't the worst of it. Carrera's deeper investigation had uncovered something that made Richard's stomach churn. Emma hadn't targeted Sterling Innovations because of some corporate conspiracy. She'd taken the job because she genuinely needed the work. Her involvement with the Workers' Rights Foundation had come later, after she'd witnessed the same pattern of abuse that had destroyed her brother's career. And there was more. Much more. The folder contained bank records showing that Emma had been using her own salary, money earned from Richard's company, to support former Sterling Innovations employees who had been wrongfully terminated. She'd been paying legal fees for workers who couldn't afford representation. She'd been covering medical expenses for employees whose health insurance had been cut. She'd been running a one-woman support network for people Richard had discarded. "Jesus Christ," Richard whispered, reading through the documents. "She's been helping them with her own money." Chen looked up from his own copy of the files. There's more. Look at the last section. Richard flipped to the back of the folder and found something that made his hands shake. Copies of emails between Emma and various legal aid organizations, all dated before she'd gathered evidence against him. She'd been trying to find legal representation for Sterling Innovations employees who had been mistreated, but every lawyer she'd contacted had told her the same thing. Without hard evidence of criminal wrongdoing, there was no case. The pension fund fraud hadn't been Emma's original target. She'd been documenting workplace harassment and wrongful termination cases when she'd stumbled across the financial crimes. The embezzlement evidence had been a secondary discovery. On the stand, Emma was describing the culture at Sterling Innovations with clinical precision. She spoke about the fear employees felt, the way dissent was crushed, the systematic devaluation of human dignity in pursuit of profit. But she wasn't speaking as a victim. She was speaking as someone who had chosen to act when others couldn't. Ms. Collins, Martinez said, you mentioned that you documented Mr. Sterling's behavior over a period of months. Can you tell the court why you chose to do this? Emma's eyes found Richard's across the courtroom. I documented his behavior because I realized that someone needed to bear witness. Too many people had been hurt and silenced. Someone needed to ensure that their experiences were recorded, validated, and presented to people who had the power to do something about it. And what did you hope to achieve? Initially, I hoped to find legal representation for employees who had been wrongfully terminated or harassed. But when I discovered evidence of financial crimes, I realized that the scope of the problem was much larger than I had imagined. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. Emma hadn't been plotting his destruction. She'd been trying to help people he'd hurt. The revelation that she'd been using her own money to support his victims was devastating. He'd been so focused on revenge that he'd completely missed the real story. During the lunch recess, Richard found himself alone with Carrera in a conference room. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Richard demanded. Because you didn't ask the right questions, Carrera replied. You wanted dirt on Emma Collins. You wanted evidence that she was a fraud or a professional saboteur. You didn't want to know the truth about who she really was. The truth? The truth is that she's exactly what she appears to be. Someone who couldn't stand watching good people get destroyed by a system that valued profit over humanity. The truth is that she spent 3 years working for you, watching you abuse your employees, and instead of just quitting, she decided to do something about it. Richard stared at the documents spread across the table. She's been helping people with her own money. 26 families by my count. Former employees who were blacklisted, workers who were injured on the job and denied compensation, people who were fired for trying to organize. She's been running a one-woman charity operation out of her studio apartment, using money I paid her. Yes, money you paid her to fetch your coffee and endure your abuse. Money she could have used to improve her own life, but instead used to help people you'd thrown away. Richard felt sick. What kind of person does that? A better person than either of us, Carrera said quietly. The afternoon session continued with Emma's testimony, but Richard found it increasingly difficult to focus. Every word she spoke painted a picture of systematic abuse that he'd convinced himself was just effective management. When she described the impact on individual employees, the security guard who'd been fired for asking about his missing pension contributions, the administrative assistant who'd been terminated after reporting sexual harassment, Richard began to understand the true scope of the damage he'd caused. The trial concluded 3 days later. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years if he cooperated fully with restitution efforts. But something had changed during those final days of testimony. The rage that had consumed Richard for months had been replaced by something else, a crushing awareness of what he'd actually done. Not just the financial crimes, but the human cost of his leadership style. 2 weeks after sentencing, before he was scheduled to report to prison, Richard did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He called Emma. "I need to talk to you," he said when she answered. "Please." They met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan business district where Richard had once ruled. Emma arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. Richard looked different, older, more worn down, but also somehow more present. The manic energy that had driven his revenge campaign was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. "I read Carrera's full report," he said without preamble. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the families you've been helping, the legal fees you've been paying, the support network you've been running." Emma nodded, but didn't speak. "I also know about your brother David, about what I did to him." "What you did to him was wrong," Emma said quietly. "But that's not why I documented your behavior. I didn't do it for revenge." "I know that now. I know you were trying to help people I'd hurt. I know you were trying to make things right." They sat in silence for a moment, two people who had destroyed each other's lives trying to find words for what came next. "I want to make restitution," Richard said finally. "Not just the court-ordered payments, but real restitution. I want to help the people I've hurt." Emma studied his face. "Why?" "Because I finally understand what I was. I wasn't a successful CEO. I was a predator. I used my power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. I told myself it was business, but it was just cruelty. And now? Now I want to try to make things right. I know I can't undo what I've done, but maybe I can help repair some of the damage." Emma was quiet for a long time. "There's a community center in Newark where I volunteer," she said finally. "They provide job training and legal assistance to workers who've been displaced by corporate restructuring. They could use funding. I'll make a donation. I wasn't finished. They could also use volunteers, people who understand how corporations work, who can help workers navigate the system." Richard met her eyes. "You want me to volunteer?" "I want you to understand what it feels like to help people instead of hurting them. I want you to see what you could have been if you'd made different choices." 3 years later, Richard Sterling walked out of federal prison a changed man. The first thing he did was take a bus to Newark, where the Community Resource Center was hosting a job fair for displaced workers. Emma was there, running a workshop on workers' rights, her consulting business having grown into a full-fledged advocacy organization. Richard had aged during his incarceration, but prison had also stripped away the last vestiges of his corporate arrogance. He'd spent his time reading, thinking, and corresponding with some of the people he'd hurt. He'd learned about the security guard whose pension he'd stolen, the administrative assistant who'd been fired for reporting harassment, the maintenance worker who'd been injured on the job and denied compensation. He'd also learned about forgiveness, not from others, but from himself. The process of accepting responsibility for his actions had been painful, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing a role or maintaining an image. He was just trying to be a better person. "Richard," Emma said when she saw him enter the community center. "You came. I said I would." They worked together that day, helping displaced workers navigate job applications and understand their rights. Richard found himself drawing on his business experience in ways he'd never imagined, not to dominate or control, but to empower others. At the end of the day, as they were cleaning up, Emma approached him. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. "The center is looking for someone to run their small business development program. It's not glamorous work and the pay is terrible, but it would help a lot of people." Richard looked around the community center, at the faded posters on the walls, the mismatched furniture, the sense of hope that permeated the space despite its modest resources. "I'm not the same person I was," he said. "I know, that's why I'm asking." 6 months later, Richard Sterling stood before a group of aspiring entrepreneurs in the same community center, teaching them about business planning and financial management. His students were mostly immigrants and displaced workers, People who reminded him of his own grandparents, hard-working, determined, deserving of opportunity. Emma entered the room as he was finishing his presentation, carrying coffee for everyone. She caught his eye and smiled, not the professional smile of his former assistant, but something genuine and warm. After the class ended, they walked outside together. The Newark streets were busy with evening commuters heading home from work. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked. "What you did to me?" Emma considered the question. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that so many people were hurt before something changed. But I don't regret holding you accountable." "Good," Richard said. "You shouldn't." They parted ways at the bus stop, two people who had once been enemies now working toward the same goal. Richard's transformation hadn't erased his past, but it had given him a chance to write a different future. As he boarded the bus back to his modest apartment in Queens, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd lost his empire, his fortune, and his reputation. But he'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that success wasn't about accumulating power over others, but about using whatever power you had to lift others up. The millionaire who had once humiliated his secretary was gone. In his place was someone who understood that true redemption came not from seeking revenge, but from seeking to heal the wounds you'd inflicted. It wasn't the ending Richard had planned, but it was the ending he'd earned. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough.